Buongiorno a tutte e tutti, benvenuti a questo nuovo appuntamento del nostro seminario dell'Istituto per le Scienze Religiose sulla depolarizzazione nella religione e nell'etica. Oggi abbiamo il piacere di ascoltare un ricercatore del centro che presenterà una propria diciamo conferenza che si inquadra appunto in questa serie di interventi a più voci e con diverse prospettive e angolature sul tema così attuale della polarizzazione, ma anche della depolarizzazione. Il titolo della conferenza è Losing Common Ground, Belief, Polarization and Disagreement. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Professor Boris RAEHME, who is a researcher at the Center for Religious Studies of Fondazione Bruno Kessler, as I said, and lecturer in philosophy of logic at the University of Trento. He works in the fields of social epistemology, philosophy of religion, and the intersection between religious studies and theories of innovation. He's the author of Wahrheit, Begründbarkeit und Fallibilität, published in 2010, and numerous articles and book chapters in philosophical epistemology, theories of truth, religion, and new technologies. Recent publications of his include Religious Disagreement and Religious Relevance, a perspective from contemporary philosophical epistemology, Eta Studies 11 in 2020, Artificial Intelligence and Religion between Existing AI and Grand Narratives, Material Religion 17, 2021, Religious and Innovation, Charting Territory, Handbook of Alternative Theories of Innovation, published in 2021. I'm very pleased to introduce Boris. Boris, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Massimo. Let me share my screen. So this should work.
It does.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Massimo. I'm happy to be here with you today, and I will present what is very much a work in progress, really. The conclusions that I will arrive at in the final section are somewhat tentative, and still everything is to be discussed, I think. This said, the topic is losing common ground, belief, polarization, and disagreement. Let me give you a brief overview, a brief outline of my talk, which will last for about 50 minutes, maybe 55, something like that. I will start with a short intro, then introduce some terminology that will be useful. I will then talk about disagreement in general and religious disagreement in particular, from a specific perspective, of course, which I will introduce shortly. I will then talk about religious relevance and religiously relevant disagreement. This is an approach that I suggest as an alternative to what we could call the mainstream approach to religious disagreement in philosophical epistemology, present-day philosophical epistemology. I will then turn to what social psychology has had to say about the phenomenon of belief polarization. And I will conclude with a summary of main points and will try to draw some useful conclusions at least. I should also mention before I start that this talk today is very much linked to our new novel, just started research project, Resilient Beliefs, Religion and Beyond, which we started a couple of days ago, really, and which is financed by the Euregio Science Fund in the context of the fourth call. Good. So now let me start by saying that the topic of religious disagreement has attracted quite a bit of attention from philosophers working on the epistemology of religious belief in recent years. The paper, or actually it was a book chapter that somehow started this new kind of discussion, was Richard Feldman's Reasonable Religious Disagreements in 2007, and a recent anthology which pretty much represents the state of the art in discussions is Benton and Kvanvig editors 2021 Religious Disagreement, and I forget the second half of the title, but you can find all these references, of course, at the end of my presentation. Now, philosophical epistemology. Now, what is that? Well, philosophical epistemology, at least in the understanding in what this means, this term means in analytic philosophy, is the theory of justification and theory of knowledge. So, very roughly, epistemologists in analytic philosophy try to figure out the conditions under which beliefs can be considered justified and thus epistemically rational, and the conditions under which justified beliefs can be said to amount to what is taken to be something more, can be said to amount to knowledge. So that's very roughly philosophical epistemology. At the same time, social psychologists have studied the phenomenon of belief polarization and have produced quite a bit of empirical evidence for the claim that the exposure to shared mixed evidence, I will explain what this means in due course, bearing upon a disputed question tends to deepen rather than diminish previously existing disagreement. Now, the aim of this talk is quite simple, quite modest. I want to bring these two fields of study together and see whether, and if so, how the conceptual tools these debates are using can be useful in understanding phenomena of religious disagreement, or what I will call religiously relevant disagreement. Let me say a little bit more about my perspective in this talk, because it might be somewhat unexpected. Religious disagreement and belief polarization can, of course, be studied from very different points of view, different disciplinary perspectives. You can think of sociology, political science, history, cognitive science, and so on and so forth. So in this talk, I will approach religious disagreement from the perspective of philosophical epistemology, and then present what social psychologists have had to say about belief polarization, and conclude with a discussion of how the two lines of research intersect. So the points that I will be making are mainly conceptual, mainly theoretical. I think it is important to try and clarify basic concepts, also with regard to discussions and debates about what belief polarization and depolarization can amount to in the fields or in the domains of ethics and religion. So this is what I would like to try to do. Let me start then by introducing some terminology, because of course it would be odd to expect that everyone has read papers in analytic philosophy and analytic epistemology. So here are some terms that I will use and how I will use them. I will use the term proposition to refer to what is expressed by the utterance, which does not necessarily have to be an assertion, of a declarative sentence in a given context of use. So I will use it to denote what remains constant in a successful translation. For instance, the English sentence "today is Friday," the Italian sentence "oggi è venerdì," and the German sentence "heute ist Freitag," as uttered by myself here and now in our context, express the same proposition. That is, the proposition that today is Friday. Of course, I do know that today is not Friday, but that doesn't matter here. Another expression that I will use is doxastic propositional attitude. Now, I take this term to refer to the following intentional, mainly to the following intentional attitudes in this talk. that involve a stance with regard to the truth or the falsity of some proposition. Believing that P or not P, being agnostic about the proposition that P, disbelieving that P, or believing that not P. So some complex intentional attitudes do involve or exclude certain other doxastic attitudes. Let me give you an example or two. For instance, being happy that P, where the lowercase letter P is a placeholder for a declarative sentence. For instance, the sentence that today is Friday, in quotes. For instance, being happy that P, I cannot be happy that P, I cannot be happy, for instance, that today is Friday if I don't take the proposition that today is Friday to be true, right? And I cannot be relieved that, say, the war is over unless I believe that the war is over. So there are certain relations of inclusion and exclusion among intentional attitudes and among those attitudes that I call doxastic propositional attitudes. It will become clearer later why I introduce these terms. Now, truth. Wow. Of course, you might say that's a big one. Well, it's not, at least not for this paper here or for this talk. No big theory is needed for the purposes of what I will have to say. All I need is really an open-ended list of the following kind. It is true that today is Monday if and only if today is Monday. It is true that writing project proposals is fun if and only if writing project proposals is fun. It is true that God exists if and only if God exists. And it is true that some birds can't fly if and only if some birds can't fly, and so on and so forth. That's all we need regarding truth and falsity for present purposes. Let me stress that I'm thereby not committed to accepting any kind of deflationary view of truth. It's just that I don't need any more in terms of theory of truth for the present context. Now, let me turn to disagreement and more specifically religious disagreement now. Recent debates in the epistemology of disagreement have focused, the general debate on disagreement, not specifically religious disagreement, have focused on what I will call doxastic attitude disagreement. And this is how I would define this, this expression. DAD, two epistemic subjects, S1 and S2, two persons, if you wish, S1 and S2 are parties to a doxastic attitude disagreement over the question of whether P, if and only if both S1 and S2 have adopted a doxastic attitude towards P, and the attitude adopted by S1 is incompatible with the attitude adopted by S2. So that's doxastic attitude agreement, I think the mainstream definition of the term in current debates. Some think of the relevant incompatible doxastic attitudes here in terms of degrees of belief, or credences, or subjective probabilities, something expressible on a scale from 0 to 1, where 0 denotes complete disbelief, and 1 denotes complete belief in a proposition. Others think of those incompatible doxastic attitudes in terms of the tripartite distinction between belief, suspended judgment, and disbelief. And I will use for expository purposes here the tripartite distinction in order not to complicate matters too much. And I hope that you will agree that, think of 3 people, S1, S2, and S3. If S1 believes that P, S2 suspends judgment on P, and S3 disbelieves P, then S1, S2, and S3 have adopted mutually incompatible doxastic attitudes towards P. Okay, a few words about suspended judgment. What is it to suspend judgment on a question? Well, here are some necessary conditions. I think, at least I take these to be necessary, not necessarily jointly sufficient for a case of suspended judgment, But a person, I would say, suspends judgment on a question or on a proposition that P only if that person does not believe that P, that person does not believe that not P, that person has considered the question of whether P, and that person has reasons for neither adopting belief nor disbelief that are connected in some adequate way, which would have to be specified, to having considered whether P is true or not. So this is what I take to be suspended judgment. So we have belief, suspended judgment, disbelief. And these three, at least for the purposes of this talk, make up the range of possible constellations of disagreement, say. Now, the question which surprisingly has attracted very little attention from epistemologists who are working on religious disagreement is how to define the notion of the religious disagreement. What is it that distinguishes religious disagreement from non-religious disagreements? The practice is really quite simple here, and in the sense that most philosophers simply use some what they take to be paradigmatic examples of disagreements with somehow religious contents, right? So, but the question of how to get from this general definition of doxastic attitudes disagreement to a definition of religious doxastic attitude disagreement merits some attention. As I said, some philosophers involved in these religious disagreement debates seem to hold that in order to get from the general notion of doxastic attitude disagreement to the more specific notion of religious disagreement, all you need to do is restrict DAD to religious propositions. And that would give us something like religious disagreement, RD, the standard definition, a disagreement concerning P. Recall P is some declarative, is a placeholder for some declarative sentence expressing a proposition, is a religious disagreement if and only if P is a religious proposition. So the idea is to restrict DAD to religious propositions and to say, okay, in that way we reach a definition of a concept of religious disagreement. An example is, for instance, Jennifer Leckey's religious disagreement question. I quote from a paper from 2014, ignore talk about epistemic peers, because I will not have to say anything about epistemic peerhood in what follows, but you will get the point. Leckey writes, I quote, what does rationality require when there is disagreement between those who do regard or should regard one another as epistemic peers with respect to the question whether P, where P, she writes, is a proposition with religious content. Okay. Now, what is a religious, or what is a proposition with religious content? Just let the point pass that usually propositions are not said to have content because propositions are usually treated as content. They are content of claims, of assertions, of beliefs, of fears, and so on, various doxastic or non-doxastic propositional attitudes. But let this pass. I think that the expressions religious proposition and proposition with religious content are misleading. And in the end, of little use in delineating the kind of disagreement that the epistemology of religious disagreement is or should be concerned with. And here's why I think so. Many disagreements that deserve the attention of epistemologists of religion concern propositions that are not at all paradigmatically religious, let alone intrinsically religious, whatever that could mean. Those propositions regard, for instance, such things as attire, diet, or gender relations. And while any one of them may be relevant to the religious outlook of one or another person or community, none of them is usefully labeled as an intrinsically religious proposition. So let me take a brief look at a more sophisticated attempt at delineating the extension of the concept of religious disagreement. And that comes from John Schellenberg, philosopher and kind of theologian, even though some would say he's not a theologian, who has worked a lot on religious disagreement. And he introduces the notion of a religious propositional field. And here's a quote. The religious propositional field is, he writes, the full range of propositions that would be counted as religious in the world today, as belonging to the religious worldview of one or another individual or group. Now, what Schellenberg says here has two parts. First, he says, if a proposition is part of one or another religious worldview that is actually being held by someone in the world today, then in the world today, it is inside the religious propositional field. The second claim is that if a proposition is in the religious propositional field, then it is a religious proposition. Recall that he talks of the full range of propositions that would be counted as religious in the world today. So I'm not sure that this is really much better than the previous attempt, but let me try to highlight some aspects of Schellenberg's notion of a religious propositional field that I think are useful. First, a proposition can belong to the religious propositional field at some time in history and fail to belong to that field at some other time in history. That means the religious propositional field changes over time as religions change, disappear, appear, new ones appear, and so on. Over the course of history, the religious propositional field changes. Second, according to Schellenberg, and I think this is a good point, we cannot find out whether a given proposition belongs to the religious propositional field at some time t by inspecting that proposition and nothing else. Rather, what we have to look at is we have to look at the religious worldviews that are actually being held by individuals or groups at time t. So that makes the question of whether or not a proposition belongs to the religious propositional field an empirical question through and through, and I think that's a good thing. So these are some stronger points from Schellenberg. However, there's something that should be resisted. I think that's the claim B. What should be resisted is the claim that if a proposition belongs to the religious propositional field, then it is a religious proposition. And Schellenberg's account is problematic because it contains precisely that claim. Now, what's the problem? The problem is that this way of putting things fails to do justice to the fact that one and the same proposition may be part of one person's religious worldview and another person's non-religious worldview, right? Now, if that's true, then why, instead of what Schellenberg says, not say the following? If a proposition P is part of one or another non-religious worldview that is held in the world today, then in the world today, P is a non-religious proposition. So I think, I hope this is clear, but this quite convincingly, I think, shows that there's something wrong with Schellenberg's account. And to bring this out a little bit more clearly, let me talk about a little scenario here. I've used this before. It has worked quite well, so I'll use it again. Scenario A. Takeshi and his friend Sarah both believe, in this case they agree, that human beings are morally obligated to avoid eating meat. Now, while the belief in question is part of Takeshi's religious worldview, think of a worldview that somehow includes the moral obligation to avoid eating meat, Sarah holds it because she finds certain utilitarian arguments to the conclusion that human beings are morally obligated to avoid eating meat convincing. Now, in this scenario, the proposition that humans are morally obligated to avoid eating meat is both part of Takeshi's religious worldview and part of Sarah's non-religious worldview. Let's say that Sarah doesn't have a religious worldview, that she has one that doesn't speak to the question at hand. Now, however, if we accept Schellenberg's account, we commit ourselves to claiming that the proposition that humans should avoid eating meat is a religious proposition. And that shows that, again, that there's something wrong with that account. Okay, let me skip 2 slides here and introduce my counter proposal to this mainstream account of religious disagreement. From religious disagreement to religiously relevant disagreement. Religiously relevant disagreement, that doesn't really sound very nice, and it is a tongue twister. However, I have not been able to come up with something better. And so please bear with me. So why not work with the notion of religious relevance instead? Here is my suggestion. Religious relevance. P is a religiously relevant proposition at time t, if and only if P is entailed by a religious worldview held by someone at t, or P is logically inconsistent with another proposition Q that is entailed by a religious worldview held by someone at time t. Okay. Now, this definition probably needs qualifications and adjustments. Let me just anticipate some objections. I will not have time to really talk about them very much here, but let me anticipate them. First, maybe the entailment relation, the logical entailment relation and the logical inconsistency relation are too demanding, and that they would exclude too much from being religiously relevant. Think, for instance, of a proposition that religious believers of some community take to be somehow part of their religious worldview, or to express part of their religious worldview, even if none of the explicitly stated religious beliefs of those people entail that proposition. So that might be a case where religious entailment or inconsistency are too strong, too demanding. Another point might be that maybe the focus should be more on what people take to be entailed by or logically inconsistent with various religious worldviews, and less on what is in fact entailed by or inconsistent with various religious worldviews. The point here is that the relation of logical entailment is an objective relation, in the sense that the proposition P can be a logical consequence of a set of propositions gamma, even if no one ever realizes that that is the case, right? So P follows from gamma, but people might be wrong about the relation between gamma and P and say, well, no, P does not follow, simply because they make a mistake. So those relations are objective relations, and maybe that's too strong, and we should focus on what people take to be entailed by or logically inconsistent with their world views or their perspectives. And final point here, maybe there are logically inconsistent religious worldviews that entail every proposition. Now, that would be unfortunate, because it would make everything, literally everything, religiously relevant, at least if we stick with classical logical frameworks in which the principle of explosion holds, or syntactically in which the rule of inference ex falso sequitur quod libet, from a contradiction you can infer whatever you want, holds. So that's another point. It might be necessary, at any rate, to rely on non-classical logic here. But that's just another anticipated objection. Okay. Let me take a brief look at a second scenario which serves to support the same points I've made before. Scenario B. Now here, this features Takeshi and Sarah again, even though doxastically different Takeshi and Sarah. Takeshi and his friend Sarah disagree about the question of whether human beings are morally obligated to avoid eating meat. Takeshi believes that human beings are so obligated, and this belief, again, is part of his worldview, of his religious outlook. Sarah suspends judgment on the question. So recall that a belief and suspension of judgment with regard to the same proposition are a real case of doxastic attitude disagreement. So Sarah suspends judgment. She does so because after having carefully considered all arguments pro and con that she knows of, she has come to the conclusion that these arguments have equal weight. Yeah? Her total evidence neither justifies believing nor disbelieving that humans are morally obligated to avoid eating meat. So she suspends judgment. Now, again, it would be misleading to describe this disagreement between Takeshi and Sarah as a religious disagreement, or as a disagreement regarding a religious proposition or question. Moreover, this description would impose an interpretation of the disagreement that at least one of the two persons, namely Sarah, but maybe also Takeshi, involved may very well be unwilling to accept, and rightly so. And now here's the advantage of religious relevance. None of these problems arise if instead of describing the proposition that Takeshi and Sarah disagree about as a religious one, we describe it as a religiously relevant one in the sense of religious relevance introduced above. Again, with all caveats that I've introduced earlier. So that's a point we can also come back to in the discussion. What I want to do now is I want to use that definition of religious relevance of propositions to define a notion of religiously relevant disagreement. That's quite simple. You can just stick in the definition of religious relevance and say the following: a religiously relevant disagreement is a disagreement concerning some proposition P is a religiously relevant disagreement at time T, if and only if P is a religiously relevant proposition at T, in the sense of relevance defined above. Now, here are some points that I take to speak for the usefulness of this alternative account of religiously relevant disagreement. First, according to RRD, the question of whether a given disagreement is a religiously relevant disagreement at time T is an empirical question. That's a point that carries over from Schellenberg's account, and I think, as I said before, I think that's a good thing. Second, in order for a given disagreement D to be religiously relevant, it is not necessary that any of the parties involved in D hold a religious worldview of any kind. So the point here is that even if we have a disagreement between two completely non-religious people, and I think maybe I should make this explicit, I think there are such people, and I think there are many people of that kind, people who simply do not have anything to do with religious beliefs, who are maybe completely ignorant or also indifferent with regard to religious questions. So the point is that even two of those people could disagree over a question or a proposition, and their disagreement could be a religiously relevant disagreement in the sense defined above. In the sense that what they disagree about is somehow relevant to some religious worldview held by someone at time T, at the time of the disagreement. Third, according to RRD, the fact that two religious believers disagree with regard to some proposition P is not a sufficient condition for the disagreement to be a religiously relevant one. I add this point because in the literature you can often find rather sloppy formulations when what is at issue are religious disagreements, which seem to suggest that for a disagreement to be of the religious variety, it is enough that the involved parties somehow are religious believers. And that's, of course, well, yeah, I mean, that's nonsense because even religious, because religious believers can, of course, disagree about anything, right? Also, for instance, regarding the question of what's the shortest or fastest way to the train station. And of course, that would not be a religious disagreement. But I included this here just because I found formulations to the effect that disagreement between religious believers is automatically religious disagreement in quite a few publications. Finally, is then to say that a given disagreement is a religiously relevant one in the sense of RRD is not to say that it is a religious disagreement. Now, one might wonder, why does the choice between RD and RRD matter? I mean, what's the point of introducing this distinction? So here are the two formulations. Again, RD, a disagreement concerning P is a religious disagreement if and only if P is a religious proposition. And here's my counter-suggestion. A disagreement, we should rather talk about religiously relevant disagreements. A disagreement concerning P is a religiously relevant disagreement at T if and only if P is a religiously relevant proposition at T. So why does it matter? Well, first of all, it seems desirable to be able to say that being a party to a disagreement over some proposition that happens to be entailed by some religious worldview held by someone in the world today, or that is taken to be so entailed by someone with a worldview, with such a worldview, does not automatically make one a party to a religious disagreement. Second, I think that talk of religious disagreement at least suggests that being a party to a disagreement over a religious proposition, I seriously don't understand what this is supposed to mean. I mean, I don't know what a religious proposition is. Anyway, forces you to take a religious stance. So substituting talk of religious relevance or religiously relevant propositions for talk of religious propositions allows us to draw the necessary distinctions here. Let me repeat. I think taking a stance with regard to a religiously relevant question or adopting a doxastic attitude towards such a proposition does not automatically amount to taking a religious stance or adopting a religious attitude. And this is something that many non-believers would want to insist on. And I think this insistence is perfectly legitimate. Before I come back to religiously relevant disagreement, let me now say a few words about belief polarization and what social psychologists have had to say about it. Very roughly, the term belief polarization, at least in social psychology, sometimes also attitude polarization, is used to denote cases in which subjects initially disagreeing about some proposition P, when presented with identical evidence, update their beliefs in opposite directions, ending up with an even more pronounced disagreement about the proposition P. So this is very roughly what belief polarization is. I will say a bit more on the next slide, I think. Usually, what social psychologists have studied are disagreements regarding propositions that concern some socially or politically controversial issue. For instance, the statement that capital punishment is an effective deterrent to the commission of murder. That would be one issue you can find in the relevant studies. Let me add some references here, just because I will not do so on the next slides. The study that, as far as I know, introduced the concept of belief polarization, but I might be wrong here, or attitude polarization, maybe someone has used these terms before them, and from which I take the capital punishment example is Lord Ross Lepper, 1979. A paper titled Attitude Polarization and Biased Assimilation, something like that. An overview covering the literature up to 1990 is Gilovich's book, How We Know What Isn't So, and a more recent study, one of many, with a focus here on opinions regarding human-made climate change, is Cook-Lewandowski, 2016, a study titled Rational Irrationality, and a relevant reading of the relevant results from the point of view of philosophical epistemology can be found in Thomas Kelly's Dogmatism, Belief, Polarization, Dogmatism, and something like that. I will. You can find the title in the references list at the end. So let me say a bit more about belief polarization. What is this? Imagine two people, call them you and I, and think of a time t0. At t0, you and I disagree. We have an initial disagreement. Regarding the proposition that P, for instance, the proposition that human-made climate change is a myth, or regarding the proposition that capital punishment is an efficient deterrent to the commission of murder. So at time t0, you believe that P, you believe, for instance, that human-made climate change is a myth, and I believe that not P. I think that human-made climate change is not a myth. Of course, no, I don't want to suggest anything. I'm not describing opinions to you here. You can swap you and I as you like, of course. We have this initial disagreement at t0. Then from t1 to t2, both of us are exposed to a body E of mixed evidence bearing upon the question of whether human-made climate change is a myth, or on the question of whether capital punishment is an efficient deterrent to the commission of murder. So social psychologists now have collected evidence for the following claim. What takes place in that time period between T1 and T2, in which we are both exposed to this body of mixed evidence E, is a process of biased assimilation of mixed evidence. So here's what that means. You interpret or assimilate, in the psychology talk, evidence E in roughly the following way. You take the portion of E that supports your initial belief that P at face value. Yeah, oh yeah, I told you so. And then you devote most of your attention to finding flaws in the portion of E that speaks against your initial belief, that is, against your belief that P. And I do very much the same thing, just from my perspective, with not P in place of P. That is, I take the portion of E that supports my initial belief that not P at face value, and then devote most of my time and attention to finding flaws in the portion of E that speaks against my initial belief that not P. Thus, of course, augmenting the possibility that at some point I will judge to have found. I will judge. Okay, I found a flaw in that kind of evidence, in that evidence or part of E, which initially seemed to speak against my view. Okay, so this is biased assimilation of mixed evidence. The outcome at time 3 then is deepened disagreement. So contrary to what one might expect, exposure to and assimilation of shared mixed evidence does not have the effect of reducing the doxastic gap or disagreement between you and me, or to leave it as it was at time 0, but of increasing it. In other words, at time t3, you are even more firmly convinced that P, even more firmly convinced that human-made climate change is a myth, and I am even more firmly convinced that human-made climate change is not a myth. And the outcome is reached on the basis of an assimilation, biased assimilation, of an identical body of evidence. So that's somewhat simplified the process of belief polarization as it is understood in social psychology. Now, some remarks to put this into perspective. Psychologists do not, of course, claim that belief polarization occurs always and anywhere, regardless of what the contentious propositions are about. it does seem to be the case that this phenomenon of belief polarization is particularly pronounced when what is at issue are beliefs concerning questions that people feel strongly about, or beliefs that people somehow take to be indicative or expressive of their personal identities or group affiliations. For instance, things, statements regarding death penalty, human-made climate change, but also abortion, pacifism, social justice, things that people, social issues that people feel strong about. Now, this process of belief polarization that I outlined would seem to be particularly pronounced in those cases. Keep in mind, of course, that those are experimental setups. So it's not as if social psychologists observe, let's say, debates, public debates, and then draw conclusions about the doxastic attitudes of the participants. They need controlled experimental designs, and this is the case for the studies that I mentioned earlier. Now, it seems to be, however, that evidence for this process of belief polarization has emerged with regard to a whole range of different issues which are publicly controversial. Let's put it this way. Now, note also that the process depicted on the previous slide can be iterated, of course. So if we take the situation at time t3 as the starting point of yet another process of belief polarization, then what can be expected is at the end of that process an even more pronounced disagreement regarding the question at issue. Maybe it is important to note that the phenomenon of belief polarization, at least as understood in social psychology, is different from what is often called the echo chamber effect. Echo chambers filter out disconfirming information with the effect that subjects nourish their belief systems with a one-sided diet of evidence to which they can react complacently by saying, "See, I told you so." As opposed to this, belief polarization concerns, at least most studies that I've seen, the way in which subjects treat mixed evidence. And it concerns the way in which prior beliefs, prior theories, prior commitments shape the way in which people treat, evaluate, and interpret bodies of evidence, mixed bodies of evidence, some of which speaks in favor of, and some of which speaks against their initial beliefs. Now, I do not really have the time to delve into the epistemologically interesting questions at this point. Two of those questions are, is belief polarization always the manifestation of epistemic irrationality on the part of the subjects involved? Another interesting question is, how could epistemic bias, the impact of prior beliefs and commitments on the evaluation of new evidence, in the way in which it occurs in processes of belief polarization, how could that be corrected for? These are interesting points, but I want to come to the conclusion of my talk today. Let me give a brief summary of my main points and indicate, at least one conclusion that I think is worthwhile mentioning. Let me first get back to the question of religious disagreement and religiously relevant disagreement. So, in a way, we face the task of indicating the range of disagreements that we want to think and talk about when we do epistemology of religious disagreement. So we have to delineate the phenomenon. The common practice is that of using paradigmatic examples. For instance, God exists, or something like that. And that practice is, of course, up to a certain point, perfectly in order. The problem arises when philosophers go further and say, and some do precisely that, say that one can reach a more satisfying level of generality by saying that religious disagreements are simply disagreements concerning or about religious propositions. Now, the problem here is to say, what is a religious proposition? And I think this is an exceedingly difficult task. I think that propositions are not the kinds of things that can be intrinsically religious or not. They're just not the right entity. I think there's a kind of category mistake involved here. On my view, this talk about religious propositions and use of that talk in defining or delineating the range of religious disagreements is problematic and not useful. And my suggestion is to use a notion of religious relevance instead. I did mention that I use in this definition of religious relevance the notion of a religious worldview. And of course, probably some of you will have said right away, well, but in that way, he just shifts the problem from propositions to worldviews. I don't really have time to, and because I don't want to speak for too long, to say or to include in this presentation what I think a religious worldview is. Of course, I will have to say something about that, and I could try and do so in the discussion. So this regards religious relevance and religiously relevant disagreement. Relevance talk does have, as I pointed out, some advantages over talk of religious propositions, in particular characterizing a given disagreement D as a religiously relevant disagreement does not impose a description of D that some of the parties to D may have good reasons to reject. So it is no problem for me or for someone, let's say, for someone who thinks of themselves as a non-religious person to accept that some disagreements that that person has with others concern religiously relevant propositions in the sense that those propositions are somehow included in or excluded by specific religious worldviews today. That's a merely descriptive claim. That is merely a description, and it does not seem to involve the ascription of a religious attitude to that person. If you talk about religious propositions, on the other hand, and you say that there is such a thing as an intrinsically religious contents, then the effect would seem to be that even people with a, let me use the word here, with a completely secularized worldview, are somehow taking a religious stance, and that's something that those people would probably want to reject, and I think that's a good thing. But this is kind of just an aside. Let me conclude by pointing out another advantage of this, of my suggestion of a notion of religious relevance and religiously relevant disagreement. An advantage over talk of religious disagreements and religious propositions. So the advantage I think that I see is this. The account of religiously relevant disagreement that I suggested does, whereas the mainstream account of religious disagreement does not, connect in useful ways with the empirical work on belief polarization of social psychology. And let me add this, one motivation of this work on religious disagreement and my dissatisfaction, let's call it that, with presently available accounts and the mainstream account, the motivation was to somehow connect those extremely, my background is in philosophical epistemology, so I'm not I'm not saying this in a negative way. Those extremely abstract debates to empirical debates on somehow the same phenomena: religious disagreement, religious pluralism, or rather religious diversity, and so on. So I think it is a virtue of an account of the kind of disagreement that we are talking about, if it somehow hooks up in the right way, or connects in the right way to empirical work in those fields. That does not mean that philosophy all of a sudden becomes an empirical discipline, or that empirical work all of a sudden becomes philosophy. It's just that it would be nice to have some point of contact between those areas. So here's why I think that religiously relevant disagreement does, whereas the mainstream account of religious disagreement does not connect in useful ways with the work on belief polarization. The point is that that empirical work heavily depends, the experimental setups heavily depend on the assumptions that, first, the mixed evidence E that test subjects are presented with bears upon or is epistemically relevant to the question at hand. So it either supports or tells against P. And second assumption, that the test subjects agree that that body of evidence E bears on the question at hand. Some of it tells against the initial belief, some of it seems to support the initial belief, but the experimental setup is dependent on there being a consensus, at least at this abstract level, between research participants, in the sense that those participants must be expected to accept that E is relevant to their initial beliefs. Now, the problem is that, to say the least, there is strong disagreement with regard to the question of what evidence for or against propositions that may perhaps go through as paradigmatically religious would look like. So there's no consensus about this, and it's difficult to see how subjects could agree even on the question of whether or not a piece of evidence is epistemically relevant to some paradigmatically religious proposition or not, given that there are no shared standards for epistemic support or disconfirmation in this field of paradigmatically religious propositions. So therefore, it is unclear how experiments starting at T0 with a religious disagreement about, say, the proposition that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. I just chose this proposition because it was the first one that came to my mind, how those experiments could proceed. Because those two assumptions are just not satisfied in this case. And probably the people would not even understand what they were supposed to do in those experiments. Okay, now as opposed to this, religiously relevant disagreements, for instance about vegetarianism, pacifism, abortion, would seem to provide a more useful and promising starting point for investigating the role of prior religious commitments in processes of belief polarization. I stop here. As I said, this is a work in progress, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Boris, for this really thought-provoking presentation. Very dense, with a mesh of concepts and notions that clearly goes in the direction of building a new system of intelligibility of religion and religious disagreement. So the floor is now open for comments or questions, or of course disagreements as well. Well, if nobody goes, I'll probably go first. If you go back to maybe
Professor Schriebe wants to intervene. Oh, okay, no, because I saw the camera. I saw it. I took it as a sign of desire of interacting. If you go back to the last slide,
yeah, let me share this again.
about, let's say, well, of course, take into account that they come from a different background and epistemological framework. So the question or comment that I'm going to propose to you will not exactly be coherent with the terms of your presentation. So I apologize in advance, but maybe we can nevertheless find an area in which we can, let's say, move on the conversation. I'm perplexed about the fact that there should be such sharp difference and even a contrast between content and relevance. And I wonder whether, instead of positing them as two completely opposite elements, they might be in a sort of a tension. Let me just give an example, but I don't know whether this is going to fit into your reasoning. There might be an empirical relevance stemming from the fact that someone holds in his or her mind the proposition with the religious content that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. For instance, in terms of having a, let's say, pragmatic angle towards existence and life that has as a theological basis the fact that, action is not important, that in the end God will solve problems, that the human intervention somehow always stays in the background. So it seems a very abstract theological content, but at the same time, it might be relevant in terms of how you understand, and also in terms of how you come to agree or disagree concerning, let's say, different pragmatic ideologies, different ideologies of how important it is to act into the world as human beings, how important it is to take action and to, let's say, take things into one's hands. So this is just an example, but it was just in order to problematize this, sharp distinction that you seem to posit between relevance and content. I wonder whether content might somehow be the, let's say, semantic basis for the, mostly, as I see it, pragmatic concept or notion of relevance.
Yeah, thank you very much, Massimo. This, I think, if I got the point of your comments correctly, this gives me the occasion to be a bit more precise here. The point on the last slide was just to say that if we take the proposition God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent as the content of a disagreement that provides the starting point of an experiment in belief, or in regarding the phenomenon of belief polarization, then this experiment will probably be very difficult to go through. It just won't. Why? Well, the reason is that if we focus on that proposition itself, you said, okay, that proposition, that belief content could have an impact on how people, for instance, judge the necessity to act in the world or to remain passive, if I got you correctly. That I completely agree. I completely agree with this. So it's not as if these beliefs are completely disconnected from the rest. No, absolutely not. The point that I wanted to make here is just that, unlike, for instance, the proposition that the death penalty or capital punishment is an efficient deterrent against the commission of murder, it is difficult to see how that mixed body of evidence that is then presented to the person that agrees with God is omnipotent and so on, and the person that disagrees with that proposition, how that body of evidence could look like. So that is the problem. The problem is simply that regarding these, let's say, high level, let's call them theological propositions, it is difficult to see how bodies of evidence which are such that the participants to that experiment agree that, okay, this is a relevant body of evidence, could look like. It's, I mean, it's not, with regard to death penalty and deterrence, we can look at statistics, for instance. We can provide empirical data which can seem to speak against or in favor of a certain thesis. When it comes to these what I've called paradigmatically religious, or call them theological propositions, it is difficult to see how to conceive of this notion of evidence. So only that was my point. I do not think, another point I should add is, of course, such rather abstract beliefs, or rather, metaphysical beliefs, however you want to call them, can have an impact on the way people react to evidence, in the sense that there seem to be certain correlations between, for instance, affiliation with a certain form of Christianity, Christian belief, evangelical beliefs, and certain political leanings. So there do seem to be these empirical correlations, in particular with regard to studies conducted in the United States. I mean, that's a little bit the field in which most of those, so many of those studies are applied. So I think that these beliefs probably do have an impact. They are not disconnected. They are not disconnected from how people act, from how they think, and so on. It's just that it is very difficult to see how evidence for or against them could look like. And of course, there's the tradition of natural theology, for instance, that says, okay, you just have to look at the world and there's your evidence. But that's something that many people would just simply disagree about. So there's no consensus here. There's no agreement about what is relevant evidence in these cases. And so those experiments in belief polarization just won't get started. With regard to those propositions, of course, those propositions and beliefs in them can form part of the background that has an impact on the evaluation of evidence concerning other, let's call them less metaphysical, more empirical propositions. I do not want to deny that. Just want to say that taking that proposition as a starting point in a belief polarization experiment, it's difficult to see how that could work.
Thank you, Boris. That was very clear. And I don't know if I'm wrong, but I detect there a kind of a Persian framework, or at least this is how I interpret your answer to my comment. In a way, you're saying that relevance is proportional to the way in which what Peirce would call a logical final interpretant can emerge from a semiosis. So when there is no relevance, or where the degree of relevance is much lesser, this semiosis can go on and on without, let's say, ontology to let this final logical interpretant to emerge as a sort of a contrast, obstacle, and even final stop to a wrong semiosis. I interpret your distinction now in Persian terms.
In a way, you're right. I mean, Peirce is of course extremely relevant in all these debates even though he's hardly ever gets mentioned. Why? Because when people talk about disagreement, well, they should also talk about agreement, right? I mean, it's just not, if you have a notion or an account of disagreement, then you should have alongside that account an account of agreement as well. And note that disagreement is not just absence of agreement, and agreement is not just absence of disagreement. These are, you have to make these things fit together. And Peirce, of course, is in American pragmatism the person who has introduced also not just the idea of a final interpretant, but also the idea of inquiry, of a process of inquiry that somehow converges upon an answer regarding every question that makes sense. He more or less he wrote like that, in the long run, where the idea is, if we just follow the scientific method, then there will be convergence. Of course, when we talk about these phenomena of belief polarization, these are, it's an interesting question whether these could be used as counter arguments to a Peircean account of inquiry. I'm not sure. It depends. There are also studies in belief polarization, however, on the impact of prior theoretical commitments in scientists, on how they react to new studies which seem to support or disconfirm their own point of view. And there are studies on the impact of theoretical commitments on the process of peer review, for instance. So it's not as if scientists are immune to these kinds of things, but it does seem to me that the context of scientific inquiry and discussion and debate, with its highly let's say regulated framework, there are very strong norms in that process. Somehow, at least here, I would like to be a Peircean person with a positive outlook in the long run, conditions under which we might expect reasonably some kind of convergence. But no, I mean the idea that this is connected to a somewhat Peircean outlook, I think is correct.
Okay, well, this is a very, very fascinating direction. And Alberto Romele has a question for you. At this point, you can switch on your cameras if you want, because you edit the video and the discussion will not be part of it.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for your talk. It was amazing. I really enjoyed that. Well, I have a really different background. It's funny because when you started talking about disagreement, I had in mind the French philosopher Jacques Rancière, who wrote a book entitled Disagreement, Mésentente, and he makes this distinction between mésentente, malentendu, désaccord. But it's very different from your background, of course. So I have a couple of questions, and just tell me if they make somehow sense for you. The first one, well, question or remarks. The first one is about a potential distinction between religious content and religious attitude. I mean, when you started to talk about religious proposition, I said, well, that's really bad because religion is not just one proposition, but it's a group of proposition. And that's why when you started to talk about religiously relevant disagreement, I was amazed, because that's exactly what I had in mind. But I was thinking, could we say that both the notion of religion's proposition and the notion of religiously relevant disagreement are connected with religious content, and maybe we should rather think in terms of religious attitude? So that's my first question. This distinction. Why is that? Because when we talk about religious content in terms of content, of course, any evaluation becomes just empirical. And that's why you put time into the framework, because you need time Okay, so that's my first remark. And my second one, and I think you partially answered to that because I think Massimo's question was related to that, is this when you talked about belief polarization, you put in the framework evidence. But of course, religions has nothing to do with evidence. So my question is, how do you bring together evidence and religion? And maybe I was thinking that here, well, we are not, because we said when we put the two groups in front of the same evidence, well, the disagreement becomes even more profound. Well, I would say, well, when it's a matter of religion, it's not a matter of evidence, but it's just a matter of putting someone in front of someone else. And it's like if the other make the evidence, and so, and it's the fact that there is another group, the simple fact that there is a group over the same argument, that makes the disagreement even more profound. So that's my 2 points. And what I would like to know, what do you think about that?
Thank you very much, Alberto. So regarding your first point, if I got you correctly, so what you say is that it's problematic, or maybe one shouldn't talk about religious propositions or religious content, but what matters is religious attitude towards some content. So your point of view would be to say, okay, look, if you want to talk about religious disagreements, then you should say something like, D is a religious disagreement if and only if both of the involved parties take some religious attitude to the content about which they disagree. Okay, and then of course the task would be to specify what it is to take to have a religious attitude towards something. You could say something like, I don't know, could think of, yeah, this becomes then a question of the psychology of religion in a certain sense, to specify.
Yeah. Sorry, just to interrupt you, one could even suppose that disagreement is the religious attitude itself.
I have to think about that one. It could be well, an expression of the attitude. Okay, to disagree with the other, yeah. I mean, there might, yeah, a religion of disagreement. There might be. Okay, so I did actually have thought about this approach, and I haven't made up my mind yet. What is the case is that in the literature that I've studied, which is in analytic epistemology, and of course I could also have talked about Lyotard here in this context, about regarding disagreement and so on. But my background is in that field, let's say, and people there tend to take a semantic approach to problems, a semantic or ontological metaphysical, mostly a semantic approach, which has to do with language, which has to do with what is expressed by declarative sentences and so on. So in a sense, it's quite contingent that I focus so much on religious propositions, or this idea, which I take to be problematic. Yeah, so I kind of agree. I have to think about this attitude approach a bit more. I think it's very, very, very important, very relevant, but I have to just reflect on that a little bit more. Then you said something like, okay, it's just, or this makes religious disagreement just an empirical matter. I think that is an advantage. I think this is an advantage. I think we should not try to have a metaphysical theory about the nature of religious disagreements, because there is no such thing. What we have is religious worldviews which are assumed and interpreted by groups of people, and which can meet and can be in conflict, can be in disagreement, can be in agreement, and so on. It's and what those groups are in disagreement or agreement about may change over time. Some propositions that maybe in some form of religion, we should talk about that concept as well, but it's daunting. Some proposition that was part of some religious outlook that has maybe disappeared today simply is no longer in this religious world, in this religious field, in this religious propositional field that Schellenberg has described, and I think that's quite a good point. Okay, the second remark: evidence and religion have nothing to do with each other. Well, that's what you think. there are many who would say no. What are you talking about? Of course, religion has to do with evidence, and you will not find these people just let's say a couple of hundred years ago, or in the tradition of natural theology. You will find them in present-day analytic philosophy of religion. And why will you find them there? Well, I don't want to be mean. I do not want to be mean, because the thing is that some of those philosophers who are involved in those debates are philosophers whom I admire enormously for their work in other fields. For instance, in logic, if you think of Peter van Inwagen or what's the other? Now I can't. The name will come back to me. So it's not as if these people are somehow not to be taken seriously. So, and those people, of course, those philosophers feel the urge and feel the need to somehow show that their religious beliefs, they are Christian believers, Catholics or Protestants, that the fact that they are religious believers does not stand in conflict, does not stand in a conflict with the fact that they are philosophers who base everything on argument, on reasoning, on analysis, and so on. So for some reason, there seems to be a desire for coherence here. And I think this desire, the fact that there are people who are strongly religious and at the same time hyper-rational philosophers, want to show that these things actually are compatible. And the way in which they do this is, I simplify it a little bit, is they take the rational framework from epistemology and apply it to religion, up to the point that some of them actually speak about religion as religious inquiry, where inquiry is understood as inquiry in the scientific sense. Yeah, and this is amazing. This is surprising. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I mean, if someone says, and of course, in a sense, I agree with you when you said, of course, religion doesn't have anything to do with evidence. In a sense, I tend to agree, but this is strongly opposed to what those philosophers would, for instance, hold. Okay. Yeah, let me stop here. I hope to have responded to your remarks.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? This is a very fascinating discussion, and there is an English sentence that is quite difficult to translate into Italian. I don't know about German or other languages, which is we agree on disagreeing. And it's an interesting sentence, I believe, because it shows that there might be the necessity to think about agreement and disagreement at the level, but also at the dialectics between, let's say, meta agreement and meta disagreement. Because in certain polarizations, it is not only the fact that people disagree that matters, it's also the fact that they don't agree on disagreeing. So somehow it is important, it is fundamental, it is absolutely vital that this disagreement is somehow eliminated. You know, sometimes it is eliminated through violence, through violent behavior. And the fact of agreeing on disagreeing is not necessarily an expression of relativism. It is the position of those who accept the fact that disagreement might be there, and it must not necessarily be eliminated from the conversation. The opposite of this sentence, we agree on disagreeing, is never like used because it seems absurd. So we disagree on agreeing, but if you think about polarization, this opposite sentence, we disagree on agreeing, might actually describe what happens when people want to find disagreement in agreement, because this is exactly what creates also social division. But this is just a free comment, on the fact that probably what you so skillfully and aptly exposed as different levels of not only different, let's say, measures of relevance, but also different levels of relevance. There's sort of a meta-relevance in this very complex matter of agreeing and disagreeing. But I don't want to monopolize the conversation because I see that there is a question by Valeria. So Boris, of course, you'd be more than welcome to comment and reply on my remark afterwards. So, Valeria?
Thank you, Massimo. Thank you, Boris. It was very interesting and thought-provoking. It's I think the very right expression. I apologize because maybe you touched already the point I was thinking about, but I had some problems with connection today. Maybe I might have missed it. I would like to come back to the this concept of religiously relevant disagreement that I find very opportune and very useful, as you were arguing for orienting also empirical research, but it at the same time opens to some subjective implications, let's say. So one of these is the possibility that the actors involved in the disagreement have different positions or also positionalities and different possibilities of grades of awareness about the fact that their arguments could have or may have a relevance for religious issues. I mean, maybe there could be the case in which this religious relevance is grasped only by the part of one of the parties in the debate, in the controversy. And this is, for example, we have discussed about this case in our attempt to write an article together on similar issue. That is the case of religiously based offense, or the case of the hurting or offending religious feelings. So there could be the case in which only one of the parties or one of the party perceives the argument of the other as an offense to his or her own religious belief or feeling, and obviously we are faced with religiously relevant disagreements also in this case, even when this is perceived only by one of the interlocutors. But which implication do you think it opens, this possible asymmetry and the problem of intentionality opens to our approach and to our study of this controversy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Valeria. So there are various things I would like to say, at least two. Let me limit myself to two. The first thing that is important to, maybe I should have stressed a little bit more, is that the notion of religious relevance by itself is a purely descriptive notion. It is not a normative notion, not by itself. It can be used to delineate or to characterize certain kinds of disagreement, taking into account the connections that there are between the topic of disagreement or the content of the disagreement and various worldview, various religious outlooks, let's call them like that, at a certain time. What you allude to, the fact that maybe in certain cases only one party to the disagreement is aware or takes into account or realizes the religious relevance of that disagreement, that is not a big problem, in the sense that it is not a necessary condition for a religiously relevant disagreement to be a religiously relevant disagreement that the parties to that disagreement are aware of the fact that they have a religiously relevant disagreement. The description framed in terms of the definition that I introduced can remain true even if some party to the disagreement would deny that they have a religiously relevant disagreement. This is one point I wanted to say. So, but what you are interested in is more, I think, the normative discourses about how to, let's say, how to deal with certain forms of also deep disagreement in societies in such a way as to make sure that certain basic rights, basic freedoms also of people are respected. Now, this is a question which is, in a sense, completely different from the one that I've tried to answer here in this talk. So I do see that with this notion of religiously relevant disagreement on its own, we get nowhere. We're getting nowhere, let's say, in political philosophy, in normative theories of societies, or in with regard to the question of how a society should be designed in order to count as a good or just society. We get nowhere with this alone. But I would say that these questions are questions concerning how societies can somehow accommodate even strong forms of disagreement. And this comes also back to what Massimo said before, how societies can accommodate deep disagreements without them spilling over into some kind of violent conflict or into some kind of hateful relationships between different parts of society and so on. Those are different questions. They are extremely interesting, but I think the notion of religious relevance does, on its own at least, does nothing to answer those questions. I think it is still a useful concept, even in those normative discussions, because I think it allows us to have a very open view, a very open mind with regard to religious relevance and what may be relevant to someone on the religious level. This is extremely open. I mean, it depends completely on what kinds of religious outlooks there are actually in a given society, because that's the only frame of reference, really. of this notion of religiously relevant disagreement. So I'm not sure I've responded to what to your points, but so to sum up, I think first of all, it's not an objection to this idea of religious relevance that there can be cases in which only one party to the disagreement recognizes religious relevance, because the description from the outside remains either correct or incorrect, depending on what kinds of religious worldviews there are at the time of disagreement. Regarding the second question, I think, of course, this has to be embedded if the question is about a just or a good society or social justice or basic rights and freedoms and so on. This has to be embedded within normative considerations, which I've not covered here in this case. Okay.
Thank you.
Agreeing to disagree. Yes, but I think the interesting thing here is to draw some distinctions. I mean, it would be, for instance, extremely odd to say, take some basic arithmetic, for instance, yeah, and you come to one conclusion and I come to another conclusion. And then we say, look, Massimo, I agree to disagree with you. I mean, this would be a silly reaction, because we know, well, no, at least one of us must have made a mistake, right? If we have different solutions to some basic arithmetic problem, in arithmetics, at least one of us, if we disagree, must have made a mistake. So it would be a silly thing to do to agree to disagree. But of course, mathematics is one thing. Social dynamics, constellations, problems, and so on, and even social science on these issues hardly ever have evidence or proof methods at their disposal which are available to us in basic arithmetic. So in that case, the more difficult and the more inconclusive evidence becomes, the more open I think one should be to agreeing to disagree in certain things, to not insist on one's point of view, or to accept or tolerate other points of view. In the case of mathematics, that would be a funny thing to do, of course, but of course, societies and interpersonal relations and so on are not in no way like the system, like mathematical systems. They are extremely messy. They are extremely suffused with emotions. They are suffused with partisanship. And it is not clear that partisanship is always a problem. Maybe in some relations, for instance, partisanship or absence of impartiality is something that we would expect, because we think, yeah, that's human. That's kind of an expression of humanity. For instance, think of close family relations. Probably I'm extremely extremely biased towards my son, for instance, when he comes into a conflict, and that people would probably say, well, yeah, you're kind of biased there, but hey, I can understand this. That seems to be a natural thing to be in that case. But if we move to these, let's say, societal issues or interpersonal relations and so on, the evidence that we have at our disposal becomes more and more inconclusive. And in those cases, I think some kind of conciliatory attitude, as for instance agreeing to disagree, is absolutely the thing to strive for.
Thank you, and we don't need to agree to disagree here, because I agree with you. So But I also see the point of Valeria's question, because in a way, this has always been the matter with the concept of relevance. Maybe not in the let's say literature that you have evoked in this talk, but in, let's say, the relevance theory of the classic relevance theory of Sperber and Wilson, and in semiotics, Prieto, the Swiss linguist. The problem, and is also the criticism, it is always about, let's say, the measurability of relevance, the fact that relevance cannot be actually measured, which is a problem from the point of view of logics, but is an advantage, or at least an opportunity, from the point of view of, let's say, different approaches to meaning, because it shows that, unlike content, relevance is actually a shifting entity. Something that was not relevant at a certain moment becomes relevant at another moment. So there is a malleability of this content that makes it more flexible, more adaptable also to empirical applications, as you showed. But I think also Valeria's point was interesting, because the question is not only that of the shifting relevance, it is also the, let's say, interpragmatics question of translating relevance. I'll make an example. You certainly remember the big issue and the big turmoil around the anti-Mohammed cartoons that were published in Denmark and then disseminated. And I remember that Pope Francis was interviewed about the uproar that these cartoons and their publication and dissemination had caused, and he didn't reply saying, well, just imagine cartoons about Jesus being published in Europe, because that would have not been translated the relevance of that disagreement. He said, I remember, just imagine that someone insults your mother, and he was talking to some, Italian journalists. So in that, I think very intelligent, very shrewd answer, he was trying to translate the relevance of disagreement, even out of a religious context, but in order to somehow give the idea of the, let's say, electric potential of a certain area and its relevance for the potential of bringing of disagreements. So in this case, I think he was translating relevance, the relevance of a disagreement, in a way.
Yes, I mean, I think I see the points you're making, and I see them very much, especially with regard to shifting relevance, very much in coherence, actually, with what I said about relevance as being a time and context relative notion, religious relevance. So. Yeah. I see the point about translating relevance, or making relevance visible, or making people aware of relevance relations, as in the case that you cited, the Mohammed cartoons. I mean, it's quite obvious that that kind of disagreement would qualify as a religiously relevant disagreement in the sense that I've outlined. So yeah, maybe I've seen.
I see that it is also Lucia, and I don't know, Valeria, if is raising your hand again, or is the previous hand
it's still there?
Or but
no, sorry.
maybe give the. Okay, so Lucia, sorry for having you wait with my long.
No, it's okay. I can listen. it's more relevant, I think. So thank you so much for this great reflection. I think I need some more time to re-elaborate some passages and discuss maybe more directly later. But I was wondering about what we can call the ontological contents of religious discourses or religious propositions. That is more or less this idea of what are we discussing when we look on, when we talk on religion. There is often this matter to say we are discussing about holiness, about transcendence, because for many believers, religion means that. I mean, it's something that has is related to a transcendent dimension. So this kind of ontological content, I imagine, could be an issue itself, and tend to create deep disagreement. Maybe I don't know if we can call them religious disagreement, because it's the disagreement is on the content and on the ontological content. Are we discussing about practices and beliefs, or is there this? How can we consider this other ontological level that is at stake? I mean, in any way, in discourses and in this kind of discussions and possible disagreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucia. This gives me the occasion to say something that I wanted to say at some point, and I didn't, however. Let me do this here and then say something on what Lucia just remarked upon. Of course, the perspective on religion, religious worldviews, religious outlooks, and so on, was extremely limited in my talk. It was the focus was strictly on what I called doxastic and propositional attitudes. And Lucia, you rightly mentioned, of course, religion is not a set of propositions. It's not even just a set of beliefs. It's a set of all kinds of things, ranging from practices, rituals, community bonds, in some cases institutions. It's a mix, let's say, a mix of very many of many different things, very many different aspects, and beliefs in this sense in which I talked about belief are just one part of what I think the religious phenomena are composed of. Your question, Lucia, was how can we include these ontological or metaphysical contents or commitments, holiness, transcendence, and so on. Well, what seems quite clear to me from this very limited perspective that I'm arguing from at the moment is that statements about what's holy or what is transcendent are precisely of the kind that do not allow for the kind of evidence that is needed if we want to talk about belief polarization in the sense in which the social psychologists talk about belief polarization. So I'm kind of at a loss here. But I think the point to take away is that when issues are concerned, what is at issue are assertions or claims or propositions about transcendence, which by definition are not susceptible to being empirically supported or empirically disconfirmed, because, well, we talk about transcendence here, then things become very, very difficult. But things become also difficult for a reason which, when people reflect upon that reason, should lead them to pause and say, look, okay, this is not something that can be settled with knockdown arguments or evidence. Still, it is something that matters to many of us. So what is the rational thing to do? Well, the rational thing to do is somehow to try and find a way to coexist. That's very general, maybe a bit banal, but I think this is one thing that one thing at least that I can say regarding your question, Lucia.
Thank you so much. Okay, I missed the little part because the battery went off, so sorry.
Okay.
But I arrived for the second part. Thank you so much, really.
Well, thank you, Boris, because you spurred a very intense debate, and I hope that some of our questions and comments were useful also to your further working on this topic. And so I thank you, and I thank also the other participants and those who listened and those who proposed comments and remarks. I'll now switch off the recording, and with the seminar will go on with the next meeting. Vi saluto, vi ringrazio, e invece forse con Valeria, Boris e Lucia continuiamo a rimanere in linea per discutere delle nostre urgenze progettuali. Benissimo, grazie a tutti.
Thank you very much to everyone.
Arrivederci a tutti, grazie.
Grazie, arrivederci.